So now that I've first given you the definition from the voices of people that have autism, I'm going to share with you the definition that we use in psychology. So some of what I'm going to tell you right now is going to be overlapping. It's just that in the manual that we use, which is the DSM-V, the language is worded a little bit differently. And actually, I kind of critique the language because they use the term deficits a lot, which I think is kind of loaded and it's ableist. In that it's talking about what people on the spectrum lack, and that's just kind of the flaw of a book that is used to describe disabilities. They're going to be using language that shows where the weaknesses are or where the needs are. So I am going to be replacing the word deficit because I don't like it. And I'm going to be sharing with you the criteria in a slightly different language. But again, this is going to overlap a little bit with the definition from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network because we're talking about the same thing. It's just using different words for it. So in the DSM-5, we used to have Asperger's, PDD-NOS, which meant pervasive developmental disability not otherwise specified, and autism. And what happened is we were like, wait a minute, this is not... These are all similar things. It's really kind of on a spectrum. So you may fall on the autism spectrum and not have a lot of spoken language. Maybe you communicate with an augmentative communication device, or maybe you communicate through pictures. Or you could be an individual who has autism and is very verbose, very articulate. You use a lot of language, and perhaps you're in college or graduate school. So again, it's a huge spectrum. I think of it like a rainbow, and everybody's different, but there are some similarities that help us to find and understand this. It gives us a common language to say why this person is functioning a little bit differently. So in the DSM, they break it into parts A and B, and then there's a few other criteria that are required in order for this to be diagnosed. So part A is persistent differences in social communication and interaction. So that is that some people may not use as many nonverbal language cues when speaking, and they may not be integrating that well with their spoken language if they use spoken language. So this may be a person who is not gesturing a lot, like you see me moving my hands all over the place. So a person who's on the autism spectrum may not be gesturing like that, and they may not have very obvious changes in their facial expression and body language. So they may also not have as many changes in the intonation of their voice, or it might be more obviously different. So there's differences in the way that they communicate socially. This can also look like difficulty creating, developing, and maintaining social relationships. And it might be that somebody on the autism spectrum may have difficulty changing their language across settings. So this could be a first grader who has an amazing vocabulary, and they go to school and they're talking to their peers with very big words that their peers don't understand. And it could be referred to like a little professor. So they are using that skill set that they have, but they're using it in a way that's not like really blending well into their social environment in that scenario. So that would be great if they're in a room full of adults. And often children on the spectrum do connect better with adults, especially in a one-on-one situation, than they do with their peers, because peers can be a little bit more challenging for them to interact with. So it has to do with, nonverbal and verbal ways of communicating and the way that we do that socially. One thing we think about is pragmatic language, so the back and forth of communicating with another person. Criteria B refers to the restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. Also, the sensory piece comes in on criteria B. So this could be somebody who has a very, very strong interest. It might be similar interest to other people their age, but they're just so into it, they get super focused on it. So that is one sign of autism. It could be a very different kind of interest that maybe most other people don't have, so it can kind of stand out, which makes it a little bit difficult to connect with other people if you don't know a lot of other people that have that kind of interest. So criteria B can also refer to repetitive behaviors. Some people that have autism, they may find it really soothing to rock back and forth. They may spin in circles, they may pace around a room, and it can kind of stand out to other people that don't have that need. So that's referred to as a stereotyped behavior. They may also like to kind of peer at their fingers from the corner of their eye. They may like to flap their hands, or they may do that when they're really excited, or maybe even if they're overstimulated. So those are some of criteria B. This also refers to being overly sensitive or undersensitive. So hyper or hyposensitive to various type of sensory input. And this could be across any of the 5 senses. So it could be auditory, it could be olfactory, so being really sensitive to smells. It could be visual. It could be tactile, so the feeling of clothing on the body or water on the skin. You may be under-responsive to the way that feels. You process that sensory input differently when you are on the autism spectrum. Some people also have a very, very high pain tolerance, and for parents of a child who is hyposensitive to pain, that can be really scary because you don't know if your little one is sick. If they have an infection, they may not be showing you a lot of signs. So it's something to be aware of and look out for. If you notice something in a child's behavior and they are on the spectrum, or if they have a different developmental disability and they communicate differently, I always want you to first wonder and be curious, is there something medical going on? Because behavior is communication, especially if you don't have a lot of spoken language. So an individual who is on the autism spectrum, if they're really uncomfortable and they're in pain, like say they have a urinary tract infection, that may be hard for them to communicate that to you, or they don't know that they should communicate that to you. And then that infection can go untreated, and it can really, when you're not feeling good, you're going to act differently, right? You're going to behave differently. You may want to act out. I know when I don't feel good, I'm not as friendly. So in general, when we're looking at autism, and as a psychologist, if I'm going to go ahead and diagnose that, I also need to be thinking about criteria C, D, and E, which is the symptoms must be present in the early developmental period. So like you're not going to be 40 years old and suddenly wake up and be like, oh, I have autism. No, this is something that you have, that you're born with, and that you have throughout your life. It's not a diagnosis. We're not going to label it if it's not causing impairment across different settings. Just like autism is a spectrum, being neurotypical is a spectrum too. Like you're allowed to be quirky, you're allowed to have differences, and you don't necessarily have a label for it unless it's causing impairment. And the purpose of getting the label, by the way, is to help people get the supports that they need to get through their life. The point is, we're not going to diagnose autism unless it's causing significant impairment in social, academic, vocational, whatever kind of settings. And sorry, I just threw a little bit of jargon at you. So across different settings, different areas of your life, impacting you on a day-to-day basis. And the last criteria would be that the differences cannot be accounted for by a different developmental disability. So somebody who has intellectual disability may have overlapping symptoms, but intellectual disability is not the same thing as autism. They are two separate things. You can have both, but they are two separate diagnoses. Okay, so you can have autism and be anywhere on the on that bell curve that I mentioned, referring to your intelligence. So in closing, I want to say that there's different ways to describe autism. I like to first use the language of people that have autism because their voices deserve to be heard. And we always want to include that in the definition. We're not going to label something unless it's actually causing impairment and the person needs supports. And one person with autism is only one person with autism. Everybody's different. So make sure to like and subscribe if you want to hear more about various topics that I want to share on my channel. They're usually going to relate to developmental disabilities, mental health, or early development. So go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.